It's time to take your business to the next level, the boss level. These are the premier business owner strategies and successes being utilized by the industry's top talent today. Rock your business like a boss, a VO boss. Now let's welcome your host, Ann Ganguza.
Hey everyone, welcome to the VO Boss podcast for another bonus episode in our AI and voice series. I'm your host, Ann Ganguza, and today I am honored to have special guest, co-founder and COO at BeyondWords, James MacLeod. James, thank you so much for joining me today. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Ann. It's great to have the chance to come and talk.
Yeah, so I've done a little bit of research about BeyondWords and had a couple of voice actors that have been creating voices with you. So if you wouldn't mind telling our listeners a little bit about BeyondWords, how the company got started, and where you see your unique place in the AI industry.
For sure. I'll give you a bit of a backstory to BeyondWords. So Patrick, who is the CEO of the company, and myself, we've been business partners for about 5 years. Mm-hmm. And previous to that, I was actually running a short form audio news app, which was a digest of the top 10 stories delivered by voiceover. We had a team of student journalists who were creating news clips every morning and every evening to kind of fire these out via an iOS and Android app. Mm-hmm. And that was called Clip It. And I ran that whilst I was at university for a couple of years. And then unfortunately, that was kind of just before the millennial podcast boom really took off. So we kind of struggled to get the users that we needed to create a sustainable business model and to pay these journalists and to pay for the studio costs and that sort of thing. But what we did create at that business was a bunch of quite cool technology, particularly around audio distribution, audio analytics, and monetization. And, at that point, podcasts were, relatively new technology, and no one had really figured out how to monetize them and to track them as well. So we created a platform which was called Dash, which was, again, targeted primarily at news publishers and helping news publishers distribute audio within their existing infrastructures, within their apps, so that they could monetize it and track it more effectively and effectively make audio a better business model for news publishers. And so that was about 5 years ago or so, and Patrick and I met. And then a couple of years later, text-to-speech kind of seemed like it was, improving. Many more people were starting to buy smart speakers, and more people were starting to use voice assistants like Siri and Alexa. And we kind of came to this conclusion that, one day in the not too distant future, people are really going to be listening to AI audio and consuming content through it, not just interacting in an assistant type scenario, but the quality of the voices will get to a point where, we'll be able to consume news articles and audiobooks and other sorts of sort of longer form content, which at that point was a game changer, because the largest cost that we had when we were doing that, the news app, was, paying for studios and paying for journalists to speak the stories. And when text-to-speech kind of got to that turning point, we thought, well, this is a technology that could potentially, do the job for us, and it could put audio on every article, which was kind of our whole mission, was to kind of be able to access any article we wanted to through audio. And so we went out and started this platform, which we first called SpeechKit, and it was called SpeechKit for about 3 or 4 years until we recently changed it to BeyondWords about a year ago. Yeah, we started off by working with the other text-to-speech APIs, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and basically building a platform around these tools, which allowed news publishers to install that technology into their content management systems, their publishing services, and start creating audio and publish that on their websites and in their apps and that sort of thing. And we were doing that for about 3 or 4 years, and then the last year or so, we have been investing more into creating our own custom voice technology. So creating voices from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
That's been kind of the focus for us over the last year or so. I mean, we've seen a large increase in engagement from audiences and from publishers for custom voices. The custom voice is much more appealing to audiences because, it doesn't sound like they're speaking to their Siri or they're speaking to their smartphone, speaking or listening to their smartphone. It sounds like a real person. And the first publisher that we did this with was a South African platform called Media24, which is South Africa's largest news publisher. They came to us because, they were using one of the generic cloud service provided text-to-speech APIs, and they wanted a custom voice that resonated with their audience. And so they provided us with a voiceover, and we recorded a script with them, and we created our first custom voice, and that was launched maybe about a year ago. And that's been hugely successful with that publisher. It's driving new subscriptions to their digital packages. It's increasing the engagement with audio on the page, increasing time spent, et cetera, et cetera. It's been a really big hit. But then the interesting thing was when we were doing this first pilot with this South African publisher, they came to us and they asked, do we have a contract to use for the voiceover? And we hadn't thought of anything like that. And we hadn't really thought about the legal process of licensing that voiceover's IP to the company, et cetera. And we kind of talked to a few people and we did some digging around on the web, and we found that this is sort of a bit of a gray area, and there hadn't been much standardization in terms of legal practice when it came to licensing voiceovers IP to a company for the use of AI. And in fact, there'd been some pretty high profile cases against companies, or there's been some quite high profile news over the last year.
Yes, absolutely.
About companies misusing voice over IP. So as I think you might know, we've been sort of involved in creating a set of standards for voiceover artists. And it's been really interesting. Now we have over 190 customers using BeyondWords, using our tools. And that ranges from bloggers using it for their writing on their own personal blogs to national news sites. So that's a short summary.
So I think for those of us that are voiceover artists, I think this whole evolution of AI and synthetic voices has kind of come upon us where we're a little bit in that maybe defensive mode where we might be a little bit concerned that maybe the synthetic voice is going to be taking over our jobs. And so in terms of consumption and how people consume content audio-wise, there's still places for voiceover artists, and there are places for synthetic voices. And would you say that news might be one of those areas where consumers are more likely to accept a voice that may not be as human as, let's say, the real thing? Or what are your thoughts about the market for this AI synthetic voice?
Sure. So I think, our view has always been that automated audio or synthetic speech is creating an incremental market for audio content. The publishers that we've been working with, large news publishers who are publishing hundreds of articles a day, it's infeasible for them to use a voiceover.
That makes sense.
From an economic point of view, and then also from a logistics point of view. So working on this technology as well, the voices are getting pretty good. However, they're still a long way off sounding as natural as a voiceover. And whether or not they will ever get to the point where it's impossible to tell between one and the other, it's hard to tell. Now, they might get pretty close, but it's still a fair few years off, that's for sure. And the ease of creating a really natural piece of content using a voiceover is by far out of the reach of AI at the moment.
Well, I think also as it evolves, as the voices get better, I think that consumers will also, it'll get to that point. Like for me, I use my Alexa every day. And so I expect that voice. I feel like I'm not being tricked into thinking that it's a human voice. So I think if there are specific places right now. And as it evolves, different markets, different ways that people consume audio, I think that it'll just keep getting more accepted. And I think large volume of audio that needs to be put out there, like for a news organization, I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense economically for them to use something like a synthetic voice. Although I'd love to say, well, hey, hire me, I'd love that. But even I, as one person, probably couldn't keep up with the volume. So I completely understand that. So what I really like is that you as a company went ahead and researched and created, I believe you've been working with the Open Voice Network to create a voice services agreement template, which you are distributing under the Creative Commons license for free, that helps protect the voice talent if they are going to enter into any agreement with either creating an AI voice or licensing that voice out for usage. So I absolutely love that. And I have such respect. Thank you so much for protecting, wanting to put something out there that can help protect us as artists. I think that's wonderful. I'd love to talk a little bit about the agreement, if you wouldn't mind, because sometimes those agreements can get really complex. And a lot of times it's something that either you're hiring a lawyer for every single contract. And I, as a talent who has done that, I always kind of recommend that if you're entering into territory that you're not entirely sure, like how your voice will be used. I always think it's a great idea. You've given us a great template to start with. Talk about how you started to develop that template and how long you've been working on that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's been a really, really interesting project, actually, and something which we've been really lucky to work on. I mean, particularly, the partnership with the Open Voice Network and being involved with those guys. And, up until about a year ago, we were just using voices which were provided to us via cloud services and through APIs. And so actually being able to get involved with voiceovers and other companies in this space has been really fascinating and also interesting to learn about the various legal practices around it. But yeah, so as I said earlier, so we had this idea of creating a standardized template that voiceovers could use to license their voice to companies, and companies could use to use a voiceover's IP. And so yeah, I guess we've been working on it for about a year, and we got introduced to the Open Voice Network quite early on in that work, which made the whole process much easier and more interesting. I guess the reason we went out and started, we thought that this was something that had to happen, and this is something also that the Open Voice Network is one of their core objectives, is to push forward synthetic speech by making it more transparent and fairer, and creating more communication between AI companies and voiceovers, and trying to avoid a stalemate where AI just kind of becomes faceless and aggressive and all this sort of stuff. And we think in order for the technology to really improve, voice over IP really needs to be involved in that process, because practically speaking, we can't create more human voices without humans. We can't create better voices without human voiceover data.
Sure.
So yeah, and so we thought in order to sort of get this to keep the wheels moving, we needed to create a safer environment for voiceovers to license their IP to companies and license their IP to AI companies as well.
And personally, I really appreciate that, because what this is going to do is going to be able to hopefully allow more voice actors to be more comfortable with lending their services to synthetic voices and not feeling as though they're being replaced necessarily. This could be, they would be able to use this template in order to help expand their services to synthetic voices in addition to what they're doing. Because again, as you mentioned before, I think there's still a little bit ways to go for the AI voices. I don't know if they'll ever achieve human. I think it's just one of those things where I think there's going to be places for each. And what your template is doing is allowing and making it simpler for the voice acting community to at least have a template to get started, to know the things that are important in order to secure and license their voice and be protected. So thank you again for that. And I'd like to kind of go, you've got a couple of different sections in this agreement. And by the way, bosses, with permission, I'll be posting the link to this template on the show notes page. So you guys will be able to kind of follow along or look at and refer to this later on after the episode. So the first part of your agreement talks about voice services. And you've got a couple of different conditions. And this is, I believe, to create the voice, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the details, do you mean?
Yes, the details for creating the voice. So either the voice talent will attend recording sessions in order to record, and you talk about a script recording, and I'm going to assume that script recording is the necessary scripts that the talent would have to read in order to create a viable synthetic voice. Is that correct?
That's correct. The script recording is actually the piece of IP that we're talking about here. The actual voice of the voice actor or voiceover isn't actually being mentioned in this contract. The IP, which is the script recording, is what is actually being licensed to the company.
Got it. So the company that has those scripts, that is the property of that company in order to create a voice, a synthetic voice for the talent. And it can either be, as I'm reading this, a one-off fee. So if I understand that correctly, that one-off fee would be that the voice talent would read the script recording, and then the company would then pay them for that. And that would be their data that would be put into their system in order to create a voice?
Yeah, exactly. So there are two payment options. You could use both or you could use one. So it's either a one-off fee or a usage-based fee, and you could use both.
Got it.
We're really trying to encourage voiceovers and companies to move towards a usage-based fee.
Yes, I agree.
The mechanics of this, we still need to kind of iron out ourselves a little bit. And then, we're now working with a handful of voiceovers to create voice models and then pay back royalties to them as their voices are picked up by publishers. But this is something that we think is going to create a much more sustainable environment for voiceovers and companies to work together.
I completely agree. And probably we've not had such great experiences in our industry when we've done the one-off sort of thing where we've recorded and then been paid, and then ultimately, there have been some issues of late that have come up where, companies then use that all over the place, or maybe without our permission, or perhaps that voice is then used to speak something that perhaps doesn't align with our brand. And so I think the whole record and get paid once and then you're done is probably something that most voice talent won't go for. I can't speak for all of them, but that's something that's encouraged in certain circles to probably avoid if possible, because of the possible misuse. And so I love the whole expansion on the usage-based fees that get paid. And that is complicated. And I think the way it works with our industry now is we are on a usage base every day. It's just, this is what we've been living for our existence of, okay, you can use my voice here and for this long. And so there's always been contracts drawn up. It's simply that synthetic voices coming into play now, and AI companies may not be familiar with the way that we've been able to supply our voices all along. So I think it's nice that we're merging, and I think we're learning a lot about each other and each industry. And I feel that if this is going to move forward in a positive manner, I think that there's just more expansion on the usage-based fee so that it's fair for all involved, really. So that's fantastic. So that's in your section, your fees and payment definition of the one-off or the use-based fees. And then you get into intellectual property in section 3. Talk to me a little bit about intellectual property.
Sure. So I think one of the main issues that we came into when we were sort of drafting the contract with voiceover artists from the Open Voice Network and others was this misconception or just misunderstanding around how is it even possible to license a person's voice? And so when we took this to our lawyers, and they said, well, actually, there's actually a pretty simple solution to this. What you do is you can just license the script recording. So instead of trying to complicate things by, licensing someone's actual personal intellectual property, which I'm not sure if is even possible. What happens in this contract is that the voiceover records a script for the purposes of training the voice model. And when I talk about voice model, it's the AI, it's the clone, the synthetic voice. In order for us to train that model, we need a sufficient amount of voice data, which is the script. And so we need about 2 hours of clean, uninterrupted audio data in order to record a high production level synthetic voice. And so the script recording is actually the piece of intellectual property that is being licensed in this contract.
Got it.
It's not actually the voiceover's voice. It's just the IP attached to that script
To the
recording.
recording of it.
Yeah. And so what happens in the contract is that for the period of the contract, the voiceover licenses the company the script recording. And so they become effectively the owners of the script recording. And then they can do various things with it. They can train the model with it, and then they can use that model to do various different things.
So when you're training the model under the contract, that is something that, as you mentioned, the recording is something that the voice actor owns. It's their property. So how is that tracked? Is the technology in place that how do we know that data model is not being used to train other models or being combined? I think that's where that gray area of all of us going, where did my data go? And how do I know that it's not being used? And I know that that's a really complex question to ask, but I'm just curious if you can shed some light on, with your research, what's happening with that?
So, I guess this is kind of the point of the contract. So the contract will define how we can use the script recording and the voice model. If we misuse that voice model and the voice actor becomes aware of that, they can come after us for doing that. At the moment, it's confined to a standardized legal process. In the future, I think you're probably aware that some companies are exploring blockchain solutions for this and that sort of thing, and we'd hope to introduce some sort of ledger, whether or not that be on the blockchain or something else in the future as well.
Sure. We're so in the beginning of all of this, which is scary, but yet exciting as well. And I think that I've said this before. I think that for voice talent to kind of look at this, and maybe some people might say you're taking a walk off a cliff, but then you might also think that you can help define the way this is going in the future. For all intents and purposes, this contract is here to help protect us. Do we have technology that can help us trace if our voice has been used somewhere else easily? Right now, we don't. As it stands, for many years, voice talent have kind of depended on other people saying, oh, by the way, hey, I heard you on a commercial tonight, and it happened to be, on the West Coast when maybe you didn't have that licensing in place. So I think that this is the same kind of a thing, but I can totally respect the bones of the contract that is trying to address each and every possible case. So what would happen, and I actually saw this in here, I think it's under the use of the voice model and TTS service. If we decide to terminate the contract at any point, then theoretically there are things in place that will help protect us. If we say you no longer have the right to use this voice after this date or period of time, theoretically the contract is there to protect us. I think we just, as voice talent, if we want to evolve with the technologies and have it work for us as an extension of our own voice, I think that we need to really take a look at this, work closely with lawyers if we decide to get into the creation of a voice and licensing the usage of that voice. And I think this is such a wonderful start. Let's talk a little bit about Section 4, where you've got use of the voice model in the TTS service. This is where you've got some line items here, which I think is great. You can specify this voice can be used with this particular script, and then that's it. I think you've got a couple of different things where if there's no prohibitive restriction or if there is permissive restriction, and then if the company might merge script recordings and voice models. Talk a little bit to those specs, if you can.
Yeah, of course. So one of the main concerns that we came into from voiceovers was this idea of a scenario of a voiceover having to compete for work against an AI in particular cases. And we sort of talked about this earlier in the call, that there is a place for text to speech, and there seems like there's a place for voiceover. And what we wanted to do with this contract was to kind of put some boundaries around that and allow the voiceover to specify where exactly they want their voice to be used and limit the usage of their voice to companies which are in those different sectors. So, for example, broadcast advertising was a format and an industry where the voiceovers told us that they didn't want to compete against AI. And it would be hard to compete against AI in that sector, if you ask me, but it's also a sector which is very commercial for voiceovers to work in. So Section 4 kind of limits that. And then there's also a clause in there which can limit the voice company from using that script recording to blend together with other script recordings to create another voice. And, I think we've seen examples of that recently, where big voice companies have used a combination of the people's voices to create a new mutant voice.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I love that you put that in there. Yeah, I love that that section is in there as well, because I think that's been a concern with, how do you track it? I think that's one of the biggest things is how do you track it? And again, like I said, it's always been in our industry, how do you track where your voice is being used? And I think this is yet another step away in trying to explain where the fear comes from, at least I think from our industry. It's no longer necessarily in my studio, right? I can control my audio that I create in my studio. However, this audio is being created one step outside of my studio. It's using my voice or a semblance of my voice, and it's being generated outside of my studio. So I think that's where the first level of, oh my goodness, how do I control that, right? It sits on a server somewhere else, and somebody else is typing in words that I may not even know what they're saying, and I may not even hear when it's presented. So I think it's just that one step away that it takes it out of our studio and puts it onto a server. What I hope is that this contract can help reel back that control a little bit in terms of what that voice is going to say and where it's going to be used. And that's where I think your Section 4 is doing a really good job of addressing all of those concerns that we would have. Let's talk a little bit about the rest of the contract. Let's talk about Section 7, exclusivity. Talk a little bit about exclusivity. If I, as a voice actor, talk about exclusivity, it might mean something different than on this particular contract. So does this mean that the company that we are working with will not go into other agreements with other voices? Exactly what is that? What is that saying?
So this is saying that the voice actor or voiceover won't go into another contract with another voice company or another publication who wants to use their voice.
Oh, okay. Got it. So it's exclusive to the company. I got it. Mm-hmm.
This is something that we haven't actually used yet. You might know that this contract is kind of built in to be customizable depending on, the voiceover's preference. Exclusivity would, limit the voiceover from going and working with other voice companies or companies that want to use their AI voice.
And that protects the company as well, very similar to how we would do it here as well. And you've got a lot of other sections on the bottom here in general. Any other points here that are in this contract that you think are worth noting here for voice talent, that affect the voice talent?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think something which has come up in recent cases, for example, the TikTok case was this concept of change of control when, one company is bought by another company, and then, what happens to the rights in the former company.
Yes.
And if they're holding rights to a voiceover's IP. And so we've put in a term in the termination clause 9.3, that if a change of control seems to be coming about, the company is obliged to tell the voiceover that they're about to go through a change of control, or that they're about to liquidate, or something like that. And the voiceover has the right to terminate the contract or to renegotiate with the new company which is going to take over. So that's another point that we basically took from feedback from voiceovers.
Wow, fantastic. Well, it seems like such a comprehensive contract. And also, I think that every contract that you enter in with any company obviously should also seek assistance from a lawyer. And I think that's super important for us voice actors as an industry to do this for every single consideration that you have to protect your voice moving forward, just as you would now without AI voices. I think that it's important, maybe a little bit more important now. But what I do like is that you've taken into consideration a lot of possibilities there. And again, what a tremendous contribution to the industry. Thank you so much for that. I really think that's wonderful. Let me ask you, where do you see your company in the next 5 years? What do you think is going to be happening to voices, to your company? It's so hard to predict the future, isn't it?
It is hard, and sometimes it's fun to go into fantasy and that sort of thing. We try and keep things as simple as possible at BeyondWords, but we've always had this sort of mission of putting audio on every article, and really improving access to news and other content through our headphones. And in order for us to do that, we just need to make better technology and make better voices. And over the last year or so, the voices part of that equation has become more and more important to us as a company. And then also, working with voiceovers and being a transparent, trustworthy, and sort of modern platform for voice licensing has become even more important to our mission, and we think something which is going to be critical to our success. So yeah, I'm not sure if that gives it's more about principles.
I really can appreciate that because it is about principle for you. It really seems like, especially with all the work that you've been doing on this contract, it certainly shows that you want to be a transparent company and want to evolve with exciting changes. I mean, I'm a voice artist. I'm also a person who loves technology, and I like to mix the two when possible. So as long as nobody gets hurt, right? So I'm excited to see how this is going to go in 5 years. And it is, I think, especially with this technology, it's so hard to predict what's going to happen in 5 years because, it is humans who make and evolve and grow the technology too. So there's always that part of it. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. You've really shed some wonderful light on things that we need to be concerned about as voice talent. If our bosses out there want to find out more about you, maybe create a voice with you, find out more about your company, tell me where they can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for inviting me on. Yeah, we are creating new voices for voice artists who are looking to get into this new technology. So just head on over to BeyondWords or search BeyondWords, one word, in Google.
Yeah. And I will actually tailgate you on that and tell bosses, take advantage of that free trial. I think for any company, if you're researching and you're considering possibly making a voice, almost every company out there will have a free trial that you can kind of test out what's going on. You can obviously explore their webpage, find out what they're about, see if they're transparent, see if they have a policy on their website about their ethics statement, and try out, if you're not actually uploading any files or recording any files, you can certainly try out their technology. And it will really, I think, shed a lot of light on where the industry stands at this point and what you need to do maybe to, come up to speed, educate yourself on the technologies that are out there. So again, thank you so very much for joining me, James. It's just been an amazing education. So Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. It's been great to be here.
Absolutely. So I'd like to give a big shout out to our sponsor, 100 Voices Who Care. Here's a chance for you to use your voice and make a difference and give back to those communities that give to you. You can visit 100voiceswhocare.org to find out more. And a big shout out to sponsor IPDTL. You too can connect and network like a boss, just like James and I today. Find out more at ipdtl.com. Thanks so much, guys. Have an amazing week, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Join us next week for another edition of VO Boss with your host, Ann Ganguza. And take your business to the next level. Sign up for our mailing list at voboss.com and receive exclusive content, industry revolutionizing tips and strategies, and new ways to rock your business like a boss. Redistribution with permission, coast-to-coast connectivity via IPDTL.